Your boy must learn to track. My girl needs a mother's milk. The hunter proposed to the lone widow. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was the beginning of winter, the kind of season that tests the will of a person, when a lone woman named Emily, with nothing but the thin cloak on her shoulders and her small daughter cradled in her arms, entered the town of Pine Ridge. Emily had once been part of a bustling family in the East, but the death of her husband and the aftermath of a devastating fire had left her without anything but the clothes on her back. Her only possession now was the small bundle of a child she carried with her. The town she arrived in was a place known for its harsh winters and harder people. The wooden buildings creaked against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys into the gray sky. Most of the town's folk avoided her gaze, whispering about the newcomer with the baby. She was a woman alone, a mother with no support. Her footsteps were slow, as if each step was weighed down with the years of sorrow she carried. The town was used to strangers passing through, but this one seemed different, as if her presence held a quiet story, one that they could not quite place. As she approached the saloon, the warmth of the building made her pause, hesitating for just a moment before she stepped inside. The door creaked open, and the warmth of the fire inside hit her like a wave. She stepped further in, her eyes scanning the room for a place to sit, but her gaze caught on one man in particular. He was tall, wearing a worn brown leather jacket that looked as though it had seen better days, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes, cold and calculating, followed her movements, but his expression remained unreadable. His name was Ethan, and he was known in these parts as a skilled hunter. He was a man of few words, a man who had lost more than most people could ever understand. The town had a strange respect for him, but no one dared to get too close. Emily, her arms still cradling her daughter, took a seat by the fire. She didn't notice Ethan's gaze upon her until he walked toward her, his boots making no sound against the floor. "You've been traveling a long time," he said, his voice low and rough. Emily looked up at him, startled for a moment before she spoke. "Yes, it's been weeks. My daughter needs care. She's been sick and I don't know what to do." Ethan's eyes softened slightly as he looked at the child. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of empathy that he did not often show. "I can help you," he said, his tone changing. "I can show your boy how to track, if that's what you need. And as for your girl, I know someone who can help." Emily's heart skipped a beat. There was a sense of calm in Ethan's voice, an assurance that made her believe he could offer the help she so desperately needed. "You would help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his eyes unwavering. "It's what I do. I help people when they need it the most." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily's mind raced, torn between hope and the deep-rooted fear that had been her companion for so long. She had never expected to find help in a place like Pine Ridge, but the quiet strength in Ethan's presence made her wonder if fate had brought her here for a reason. Ethan didn't say another word. He simply gestured for her to follow him as he stepped out of the saloon and into the cold air. The town may have been harsh, but for the first time in months, Emily felt the faintest stirrings of hope. As they walked through the snow-covered streets, the weight of her past began to lift, just a little. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew this. There was a chance, however small, that she and her daughter might find the family they had been longing for. And that chance, no matter how uncertain, was something worth fighting for. I have to admit, Emily had not expected things to move so quickly. Less than a week ago, she had been a stranger to Pine Ridge, unsure of how she would make it through the winter with her young daughter. Now, she found herself walking side by side with Ethan, the lone hunter who had offered his help in a way that both comforted and unsettled her. She had heard the rumors about him, the quiet man who never asked for anything, the one who could survive alone in the wilderness for weeks on end. Yet, there was something about him that made her feel safer than she had in a long time. As they walked through the snow-covered streets, the weight of her past began to feel a little lighter, as though the quiet town of Pine Ridge might just be the place she had been searching for. As they approached the edge of town, Emily's heart skipped a beat. The town had its share of rugged folk, but it was nothing compared to the wilderness just beyond. Ethan stopped in front of a small cabin, nestled on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, its chimney puffing out small wisps of smoke. He turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. "This is where I live," he said simply. "I'll take you inside. Get your daughter some rest. We'll start at dawn." Emily nodded, grateful, but still uncertain of the future. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he led her into the cabin, where the warmth from the fire immediately enveloped them. The scent of wood smoke and dried herbs filled the air. Ethan's cabin was simple, but it felt like a refuge, a place of safety in a world that had shown her little kindness. She looked around, noting the maps pinned to the walls, the neatly stacked firewood by the door, and the rifle resting on the mantel. Everything in this cabin was orderly, as though Ethan lived by a set of rules that no one could break. Emily felt a slight tension in the air, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the sheer quietness of the place, the stillness that made her feel like an intruder. As she placed her daughter on the small cot near the fire, Ethan moved toward the small kitchen area, lighting an oil lamp. "I'll make you something to eat," he said without looking up. "You must be hungry." Emily watched him for a moment, her mind racing. Ethan hadn't said much since they met, but his actions spoke volumes. He had offered her help without hesitation, despite the cold distance he kept from others. She wanted to understand him more, to know what kind of man he was. But the truth was, she was just as much of a mystery to him. She was a widow, a mother, a woman who had known nothing but hardship for the past few years. And yet, here she was, in a stranger's cabin, hoping to find some semblance of peace. As Ethan prepared the meal, Emily's daughter stirred restlessly in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out as though searching for something to hold on to. It made Emily's heart ache to see her child so vulnerable, but she pushed the feeling aside. Her daughter needed her strength now more than ever. When the meal was ready, Ethan set 2 bowls on the table. He didn't sit, but rather stood by the window, watching the snow fall outside. Emily picked up her spoon and took a bite. The warmth of the food comforted her, but it did little to calm the storm brewing in her heart. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she find a home here in Pine Ridge? Would Ethan's offer of help turn into something more? She didn't know. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. After they ate, Ethan took a seat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. Emily sat quietly across from him, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of shared understanding, of 2 people who had seen too much to be easily fooled by words. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Tomorrow, I'll teach your boy how to track." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching for any hint of emotion, but his face remained as unreadable as ever. "I don't know if he's ready," she said softly. "He's just a child." Ethan's eyes softened for the first time. "Children learn faster than you think," he said simply. "And sometimes, they need to learn things that we're not ready to teach them." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She had never been one to rely on others, especially not men like Ethan. But something in his words rang true. Her son needed to learn how to survive, how to make his way in the world. And she needed to find a way to give him that chance. As the night deepened, the crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin. Emily and Ethan sat in the quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Tomorrow would be a new day, and with it, a chance to begin again. The next morning, the pale light of dawn filtered through the small cabin window, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Emily woke to the sound of soft breathing beside her, her daughter still asleep in the warmth of the fire's glow. For a brief moment, the weight of her journey seemed distant, almost bearable. But reality quickly set in. Today, her son would begin his training, and she would have to face a world that had not been kind to her or her family. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her daughter, and moved toward the kitchen area. Ethan had already prepared breakfast, just simple bread and stew, but it felt like more than enough. She sat down at the table, the smell of warm food filling the cabin, as Ethan came in from the small porch, brushing off the snow that had begun to fall again. He didn't speak at first, just placed his rifle by the door and went to stoke the fire. "We'll leave after breakfast," he said finally, his voice as steady as ever. The woods are quiet in the morning. Good time for a lesson. Emily nodded, her heart a little heavy with the thought of sending her son off with a man she barely knew. But she knew this was important. Her boy needed to learn, and Ethan, despite his silence, seemed to be the right person for the job. After breakfast, they gathered their things. Ethan handed Emily a thick cloak, its wool lining warm against the cold morning. "You'll stay here with your daughter," he said. "I'll take your boy into the woods." Emily looked up at him, her concern showing on her face. "Is it safe? Will he be all right?" Ethan gave her a brief, reassuring glance. "He's ready. Trust me." She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She had no choice. The only thing that mattered now was the survival of her family, and she would do whatever it took to make sure they had a chance. Her son, David, had been quiet that morning, his eyes wide with nervous excitement. It was clear that he didn't fully understand what was to come, but there was a flicker of determination in his gaze that reminded Emily of his late father. He had inherited his father's strength, but also the vulnerability of being young and alone in a harsh world. As they stepped outside, the air was sharp and biting. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way toward the tree line. Ethan walked ahead, his movements purposeful and calm, while David followed closely behind, glancing back at his mother one last time. Emily watched them for a moment, her heart tightening. This was the first time she had ever trusted anyone else with her son, but there was something about Ethan's steadiness that made her believe he would be all right. The woods were quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. Ethan stopped occasionally, pointing out tracks in the snow, deer, rabbit, and even a coyote. He showed David how to observe the signs of wildlife, how to track and read the land for clues. It was a slow, deliberate process, each step taken with patience and focus. As the morning wore on, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this time to herself, this quiet, this chance to breathe. She sat by the fire, her daughter nestled beside her, and allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. It was only when the sound of footsteps returned, soft but distinct, that she snapped her eyes open. Ethan and David were back, both of them covered in snow, but with smiles on their faces. David's eyes were alight with excitement, his cheeks rosy from the cold. "I did it, Mama," he exclaimed, his voice filled with pride. Ethan gave him a nod, his expression unreadable as always. "He learned faster than I thought," Ethan said, his tone unusually soft. Emily couldn't help but smile. "I knew he would," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to, how much she had doubted David's ability to survive until she saw the pride in his eyes. That was all she needed. Ethan remained silent, but his approval was clear in the way he looked at her son. "He's ready for the next lesson," Ethan said, "but that will come in time. For now, he's done well." Emily didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew that they were on the right path. The road ahead would be hard, there was no doubt about that. But for the first time since she had arrived in Pine Ridge, she felt like she was no longer alone. She had found a kind of family, in the most unexpected of places. And that, she realized, was worth more than anything. As they sat by the fire that night, Emily knew that she was no longer just a widow or a mother on the run. She was part of something new, a family forged through hardship, a bond that had been built on trust, survival, and the quiet strength of the man who had promised to help them find their way. The following days passed quietly, as Emily and her son, David, adjusted to their new life in Pine Ridge. Ethan's presence was a constant, his calm demeanor providing a sense of security that Emily hadn't known in a long time. Though he spoke little, his actions spoke volumes, and she found herself relying on him more than she ever expected. One morning, as the snow began to fall again, heavier than before, Ethan made his usual trek out into the woods. Emily had grown used to these daily routines, where he would leave before dawn to scout the area for any signs of danger or food, and return with tales of the wild, of tracks, trees, and the way the weather shifted. David had become more confident, his lessons with Ethan paying off. The boy's movements in the woods were becoming more sure, his eyes sharper, the patience of the hunter beginning to show in his young frame. He was beginning to understand the world in a way that Emily could never have taught him. It was a good feeling, watching her son grow, even in the midst of all the uncertainty that surrounded them. That afternoon, as Emily prepared supper, she heard the sound of hooves outside. It was a noise she hadn't expected, and for a moment, her heart skipped a beat. Ethan was still out hunting, and no one else was supposed to be coming by. The sound grew louder, then stopped. She moved cautiously toward the window, peeking out to see who had arrived. Through the snow and mist, she saw two riders, cloaked in dark furs, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Emily's pulse quickened. She had lived long enough in these harsh lands to know that not all visitors meant well. She backed away from the window, her mind racing as she reached for the rifle that Ethan had left by the door. She didn't know if she was being paranoid, but instinct told her that these men were trouble. As the door creaked open, she spun around, ready to defend herself. But the figure that stepped through was not one she had expected. It was Ethan, returning earlier than usual. Behind him, a stranger stood, tall, with the look of a man who had spent far too many years traveling alone. His eyes were dark and intense, his gaze briefly meeting Emily's as he nodded. Ethan stepped forward, closing the door behind him. "This is Roy," he said, his voice flat. "He's a friend from the South. I've known him a long time." Emily relaxed, but only slightly. She wasn't sure what to make of this new arrival. Roy looked worn, like he had been riding for days, his clothes covered in dirt and snow. He had a rough look about him, his face lined with experience and the weight of many hard years. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Roy said, his voice gravelly. "Just need a place to rest. The storm's closing in, and it's been a long ride." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes still studying him. She had learned to be cautious, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he carried himself that made her believe he wasn't a threat. Still, she was on edge. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "You're welcome to stay for the night." Roy smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He walked over to the fire, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just long enough to ride out the storm." Ethan didn't say much, his eyes watching Roy closely. Emily could tell that whatever history they had together, it wasn't something Ethan was eager to talk about. The silence between them stretched for a while, only interrupted by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. As the night wore on, Emily prepared another meal, this time including the stew she had made earlier. She offered it to Roy, who accepted gratefully, though he didn't speak much. David, curious as always, wandered into the room and stared up at the stranger. "Who's that, Mama?" he asked, his voice innocent. Emily glanced at Roy before responding. "His name is Roy. He's just passing through." David's eyes widened. "He looks like a cowboy," he said, fascinated. Roy chuckled at the boy's observation, a rare softening in his hardened demeanor. "Guess you could say that," he said. "I've seen my fair share of dust storms and cowboys in my day." Emily smiled, though the unease still lingered in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would change things in ways she wasn't prepared for. After dinner, Roy settled by the fire, his eyes never straying too far from Ethan. Emily tried to shake off the tension in the room, but it was difficult. She had a bad feeling about Roy's arrival, though she couldn't put her finger on why. The storm outside had only grown fiercer, the wind howling like a living thing. The flames in the hearth flickered and danced, casting long shadows on the walls. As Emily watched the fire, her thoughts wandered. She knew life wasn't easy in Pine Ridge, but for the first time since she had arrived, she felt as though she had found a place where she might belong. She didn't know what Roy's arrival meant, but she knew that, for better or worse, it would shape the path ahead. And, whatever happened, she had to stay strong, for David, for herself, and for the family they were starting to build. The storm raged through the night, its fury unforgiving. Inside the cabin, the crackling fire was the only source of warmth as the wind howled outside. Emily sat by the hearth, her daughter asleep in her arms, while Roy settled into a corner, his eyes fixed on the flames. Ethan, though quieter than usual, stood by the door, his attention divided between the storm and the stranger who had appeared so suddenly. The tension in the room was palpable, yet for some reason, it felt like an unspoken agreement to let things unfold naturally. Emily could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, and she knew that something was about to change. The question was, would it be for better or worse? The following day, the storm had finally let up, but the air was still thick with snow. It was the kind of day when everything seemed muffled, as if the world was holding its breath. Ethan was the first to stir. He checked the rifles by the door, then turned to Emily. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. Emily nodded, though her heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, unsure of what would come next. "About Roy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the table where a map lay spread out, his fingers tracing the lines of the land. "Roy's not just passing through," he said finally. "He's running from something." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, a mix of caution and concern. "There's trouble following him. Trouble that will eventually find its way here." Emily felt a chill run through her, though the fire still burned brightly in the hearth. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice shaky. Ethan took a deep breath, his expression hardening. "The kind that can tear a community apart. Roy's been a fugitive for a long time. The law's after him, and so are people who don't play by the rules. If they find him, they'll come after anyone who's standing in their way." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. The situation had just become more complicated. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan met her gaze for a long moment, his jaw tight. "It means we need to be prepared. You, David, and your daughter. If anything happens, you'll need to leave. I'll stay behind to handle things." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had never considered running, not since arriving in Pine Ridge. But now, with the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air, she understood. The danger wasn't just something that might happen, it was inevitable. "I won't leave," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear rising in her chest. "I won't abandon you." Ethan's face softened, just slightly, and he stepped closer to her. "I'm not asking you to, but I need you to understand what's at stake. There are people who won't stop until they get what they want. And if they find Roy, they'll come for all of us." Emily's heart raced as she processed his words. She had always been a fighter, never one to back down from a challenge. But this felt different. This wasn't a fight she could win on her own. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan's eyes darkened. "We prepare. We keep our heads down and wait for the right moment." He paused, looking toward the door. "We don't know how long we have, but we can't take chances." Emily nodded, her mind spinning with the possibilities. She had hoped, for a moment, that this place, this quiet town, might be their safe haven. But she now understood that peace was fleeting, and danger had a way of finding even the most secluded places. As she watched Ethan prepare, her heart ached with uncertainty. Would they make it through this storm, both literal and metaphorical? Or would the shadows of their pasts catch up to them? For the first time since she had arrived in Pine Ridge, Emily felt the weight of the future bearing down on her. She had come to this place seeking refuge, but now, it seemed that survival was all she could focus on. David's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mama, is it okay if I go outside? I want to play in the snow." Emily turned to him, her heart softening at the sight of his innocent face. It was hard to reconcile the boy she loved with the dangers that were now closing in. "Not today, sweetheart," she said gently. "Maybe tomorrow." David nodded, but Emily could see the disappointment in his eyes. She hated having to shelter him from the truth, but she knew it was necessary. As Ethan finished making preparations, Emily took a moment to collect herself. The world outside was cold, but inside, the fire still burned bright. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were still together. And in a world where everything else was uncertain, that was all that mattered. The days that followed were filled with tension, as the storm outside seemed to mirror the growing unease inside the cabin. Emily could feel the weight of the danger that Ethan had warned her about, and though she tried to keep things normal for her children, it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the reality of the situation. Each morning, Ethan ventured out into the wilderness, as he always did, but this time, there was an edge to his movements, a heightened awareness that was hard to miss. He would return late, his face set in a hard line, offering little in the way of conversation. Roy, too, remained distant, though he occasionally exchanged a few words with Ethan. Emily kept her distance from both men, knowing that the tension between them was thick, even if it was never spoken aloud. It wasn't until the 5th day after Roy's arrival that things began to change. The wind had picked up again, the air growing colder with each passing hour, as if nature itself was pushing them into a corner. Emily was sitting by the fire, nursing her daughter, when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. Her heart sank as she realized that Ethan and Roy were not the only ones in the area anymore. She stood quickly, moving toward the window, her hand resting on the rifle that was now a constant companion. Through the glass, she saw a group of men, 5 or 6, maybe more, riding hard toward the cabin. They were dressed in furs and heavy coats, their horses kicking up the snow as they approached with purpose. Fear gripped Emily's chest. She recognized the leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek. He was the one Roy had been running from. The outlaw leader, Cutter, had arrived. She turned toward the back of the cabin, her mind racing as she quickly checked the supplies. Ethan had left hours earlier, and she didn't know if he had seen the riders coming or if they had caught him by surprise. She grabbed her daughter and moved to the far corner of the cabin, doing her best to remain quiet. As the sound of the horses grew louder, Roy suddenly appeared. In the doorway, his face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "I didn't think they'd come this fast. We don't have much time." Emily's heart pounded as she tried to calm herself. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight. Roy glanced toward the door, his eyes filled with regret. "We fight," he said simply. "If we don't, they'll take everything from you. Your home, your family, everything." Emily's eyes widened, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always known there would be danger, but she had hoped that Pine Ridge would be the place where they could escape it. Roy's expression softened for a moment, and he looked at her with a mixture of guilt and resolve. "I never wanted this to happen," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But we're here now. I'll help you protect your family." Emily didn't know what to say. She had never been a fighter, never had to face the kind of violence that was now at her doorstep. But she knew that Roy was right. If they didn't defend their home, they would lose everything. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Then let's do it," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Roy nodded and moved toward the door, his hand resting on the rifle by the wall. "Get ready," he said, his voice now steady. "Stay behind me, keep low, and we'll get through this." Emily gathered her daughter in her arms, keeping her close as she moved toward the back of the cabin, where the small supply of food and water was hidden. She had no illusions about what was coming. Cutter and his men would stop at nothing to take what they wanted, and Emily would do everything in her power to stop them. As the door to the cabin creaked open, Roy stepped outside first, followed by Ethan, who had arrived just in time. The two men exchanged a brief glance, their faces grim but determined. "Stay out of sight," Ethan told Emily. "We'll handle this. But if they break through, don't hesitate. Protect your family at all costs." Emily nodded, her heart in her throat. She could hear the men approaching now, their laughter and loud voices carrying through the cold air. Roy and Ethan moved to take position by the trees, their weapons ready. Emily hugged her daughter tightly, her mind racing. She had never been in a situation like this before, never imagined that one day she would be standing in her own home, ready to fight for her life. The world outside had always felt so distant, so far away from the peaceful life she had imagined. But now, the world was at her door, and it was demanding that she make a choice. Stay and fight, or run and lose everything. She knew there was only one choice that made sense. She would fight, for her family, for her future. As the first of Cutter's men reached the cabin, Emily's grip tightened on the rifle. She wasn't ready for what was coming, but she was ready to face it, and she would do whatever it took to protect what was hers. The door slammed open, and a chill swept through the room as Cutter's men poured inside. Emily's heart raced, but she kept her breath steady, holding her daughter close, her fingers wrapped tightly around the rifle in her hands. From her hiding spot at the back of the cabin, she could see everything unfold through a small crack in the wall. Cutter's men were rough-looking, their faces hardened by years of lawlessness. They sneered and laughed as they entered, clearly expecting little resistance. But they were wrong. Ethan and Roy had taken their positions in the snow outside, crouching low, their rifles trained on the approaching outlaws. Roy's eyes scanned the area, and when the first man appeared at the door, Ethan's shot rang out, a loud crack that split the air. The man staggered back, a muffled scream escaping his lips as he fell into the snow. The others scrambled, some ducking behind the trees, others reaching for their weapons. Emily's pulse quickened, but she stayed silent. She could hear the commotion outside, the chaos that erupted as the outlaws tried to regroup. Cutter barked orders to his men, his voice sharp and filled with rage. "Get inside. Now." One of the men near the door lunged, but before he could take another step, Roy's voice cut through the din. "Not so fast." The rifle fire was quick, sharp, and precise. Another man dropped to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. Cutter's men hesitated, unsure of their next move, but Cutter's growl was all it took to rally them. "We've got them outnumbered. Move in." The tension outside was palpable as the rest of the outlaws pushed forward, rushing toward the cabin. Inside, Emily's fingers tightened on the rifle. She could hear the shuffling of boots in the snow, the pounding of fists against the walls. Cutter's voice was loud now, directing his men to break down the door. "They can't hold us off forever. Get in there and finish this." The door shook under the force of their blows. Emily's breath hitched, but she kept her composure. The fire still burned in the hearth, but she was no longer concerned with warmth. Her focus was solely on the door, and on the people she needed to protect. David tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mama, what's happening?" Emily swallowed hard, her voice steady as she answered. "We have to stay quiet, sweetheart. Stay hidden, and everything will be okay." She could feel her daughter's soft breath against her shoulder, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest as the sound of the door grew louder, the thudding of the outlaws growing stronger. Cutter's men were almost there. And then, with one last final push, the door splintered. Cutter stepped inside, his dark eyes scanning the cabin. "So, this is where you've been hiding," he said, his voice a low growl, filled with menace. His gaze flicked toward Emily and the child she held, the widow and her little ones. "You're not so tough now, are you?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. Cutter was a man who had caused enough pain, and she would be damned if she let him take what little peace they had left. Outside, she heard the sharp crack of another shot. The sound of the wind howling seemed to intensify as the firefight continued. Ethan and Roy were still holding their ground, but they were outnumbered. The odds were against them. Cutter took another step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his pistol. "This is the end of the line for you, widow. You should have stayed out of my way." Emily's mind raced, and in that instant, she knew what she had to do. "If you want me," she said, her voice firm and clear, "you'll have to get through me first." Cutter's laugh echoed through the cabin. "You think you can stop me? You're just a woman." Emily's fingers tightened on the rifle. She wasn't just a woman. She was a mother, a survivor, and she would fight for her family. With a sudden movement, she fired. The shot rang out, a sharp crack in the air. Cutter's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. His men hesitated, confusion spreading through their ranks. Roy's voice rang out in the distance. "Ethan now." The signal was enough. Ethan fired again, his shot finding its mark. One of the men fell. Then another. Cutter roared in pain, but the tide was turning. The outlaws, realizing they were losing their advantage, began to scatter. Cutter's men were retreating, but Cutter himself was still on his feet, his face twisted in rage. He raised his gun, ready to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, Roy took aim. The shot rang out, loud and clear, and Cutter collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The fight had ended as quickly as it had begun. The sound of the wind outside seemed to die down, the air growing eerily quiet. Emily stood frozen for a moment, the rifle still in her hands, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The men who had threatened her family, who had taken everything from so many before, were gone, and they were never coming back. Slowly, she lowered the rifle, her hands trembling, but still steady. Roy and Ethan moved cautiously into the cabin, their eyes scanning the room. "Is everyone all right?" Ethan asked, his voice calm, but with a hint of concern. Emily nodded, her breath still coming in quick, shallow gasps. "We're all right," she said, her voice stronger now. "Thanks to you." Ethan gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "We'll need to stay alert. But for now, you're safe." Emily didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. They had survived. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. The wind had died down, and the snow lay thick on the ground, covering everything in a blanket of white. The threat that had loomed over them had been vanquished, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Cutter and his men were gone, and with them, the fear that had plagued Emily and her family. But there was no real peace yet. Ethan and Roy spent the next few days cleaning up the aftermath. Cutter's body was buried in the woods, along with his men, while the remnants of their camp were scattered, left for the animals to reclaim. Emily, despite her relief, couldn't shake the feeling that the world they had fought so hard to protect was slipping through her fingers. Her thoughts often drifted to what might have been if they hadn't stood their ground. What would have happened if they had given in to fear, if they had run instead of fighting? But she pushed those thoughts aside. The battle was over. They had survived. And that was enough for now. One evening, as Emily sat by the fire with David and her daughter, Ethan came in from outside. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different in his eyes. He looked tired, as if the weight of the last few days had finally caught up with him. He paused in the doorway, looking at Emily for a long moment before he spoke. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low and steady. Emily looked up at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" she asked, her heart quickening. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and leaned against the wall. "It's about Roy," he began. "He's not just some outlaw running from the law. He's been hiding from something much worse." Emily's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Roy's not the man he says he is. He's been on the run for a long time, trying to escape a past that's caught up with him. The men who were chasing him aren't just ordinary criminals. They're part of something bigger, something dangerous." Emily's pulse quickened. She had known Roy had a past, but she had never imagined it was anything like this. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her, his expression heavy. "Roy's been working as a bounty hunter for years," he said. "But he's not after the typical criminals. He's been hunting down people who've betrayed others, people who've committed atrocities. He's worked with some dangerous people, people who don't care who they hurt to get what they want." Emily felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "So, what does this have to do with us?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. Ethan took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "The men who were after Roy, they're part of a much bigger organization. They're ruthless, and they don't stop until they get what they want. They came for him once, but they'll come again. And next time, they might not be so easy to fight off." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. This was worse than she had imagined. She had known there was danger, but this was something far more sinister. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his eyes dark with the weight of the truth. "We prepare," he said simply. "We make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. We can't let our guard down." Emily nodded slowly, her mind racing with the implications of what Ethan had just told her. She had hoped that, after everything they had been through, they might find some peace. But now, she understood that peace was something they could never take for granted. They had to stay vigilant, stay strong, and be ready for whatever the world would throw at them next. Later that night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Emily sat alone by the hearth. David was asleep beside her, his small form curled up under a blanket, while her daughter rested in the crib near the fire. The cabin felt empty without the tension of the past days, but it also felt fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. Emily thought about the life she had hoped for, a quiet life, away from the dangers of the world. But now, that life seemed so far out of reach. The danger was never truly gone. It would always be there, lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had fought to protect her family, and she would continue to do so, no matter what. With each passing day, Emily felt her resolve grow stronger. She was no longer just a widow. She was a mother, a protector, and a fighter, and she would not let anything take her family from her. As the wind howled outside, Emily knew that they were far from safe. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the storm, and they would survive whatever came next. Days passed in tense silence, with every creak of the cabin floor echoing louder than the wind outside. Emily had hoped for peace, but instead, the shadow of the past lingered, threatening everything they had built. Cutter's death had temporarily lifted the immediate danger, but the truth Ethan had revealed about Roy kept gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the calm they were experiencing was merely a lull before the storm. Ethan, Roy, and even David seemed to feel it too, though none of them spoke of it aloud. They kept themselves busy, repairing the cabin and restocking supplies, but their movements were deliberate, cautious. The tension in the air never fully left, and Emily found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, listening for sounds of approaching danger. It was a restless kind of peace, the kind that settles uneasily in your bones, reminding you that survival isn't guaranteed. Then, one morning, everything changed. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, and before the sky could darken with the storm's arrival, the sound of galloping hooves broke through the silence. Emily's heart lurched in her chest. She turned to Ethan, who had been outside, checking the traps. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "Get inside now," he ordered quietly, though his voice carried the weight of a command. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed her daughter from her crib, clutching her tightly, and motioned for David to follow her. Roy was already inside, his hand on the rifle, his eyes narrowing as he watched the approaching riders. Ethan moved quickly, securing the door behind him, his hand resting on his own weapon as he checked the window. The storm clouds were gathering above, making the sky dark and ominous, but it wasn't the storm that had Emily's attention, it was the riders. There were 5 of them, silhouetted against the gray sky, their figures menacing and unmistakable. Cutter's men. They had come for Roy. As the sound of the hooves grew louder, Emily could feel her breath catch in her throat. The riders pulled up outside the cabin, and she could hear them dismounting. Their boots crunched in the snow, the sound unnervingly close. "He's here," Roy muttered, his voice tight. "They've found me." Emily's pulse quickened. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she knew the answer before Ethan spoke. "We fight," Ethan said, his tone steady and final. "We've prepared for this. Stay close, and do exactly as I say." The door shuddered as someone outside kicked it, testing its strength. The cold air rushed in, and the wind howled louder. "Roy," a voice called out from the other side, the words carrying a familiar bitterness. "We know you're in there. Come out and face the consequences." Roy's face tightened, his hand gripping the rifle. "They won't stop until they have me," he said, his eyes hard with resolve. Ethan gave him a single nod. "We'll make sure they don't take anyone else." Emily held her breath, watching as Ethan moved to the back of the cabin, his boots silent on the floorboards. Roy followed closely behind, positioning himself near the window, while Emily crouched down, holding her daughter close. David was beside her, his small body trembling with fear, though he said nothing. It was the silence that was the most unbearable. Everything seemed to hang on the edge of that moment. And then, as the door gave way with a loud crack, the chaos erupted. The riders poured in, filling the small cabin with their rough voices and the stink of sweat and alcohol. "Where is he?" one of them shouted, a gun raised in the air. "You think we're playing around?" The others laughed, but there was no humor in their eyes. "We've come for you, Roy. Time to pay for your past." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tightened her grip on her daughter. Roy's eyes flashed with anger, but Ethan was the first to act. He stepped out from the shadows, his rifle aimed at the group. "No one's going anywhere," he said, his voice calm, but with a lethal edge. The room froze. "Get out now, or I'll make you regret it." Ethan continued, his rifle unwavering. The men hesitated, their eyes flicking between Ethan and Roy. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "You think you can stop us? We've got more men than you." Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't care how many men you've got," he said. "You're not taking anyone else." The standoff was tense, the air thick with the threat of violence. Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she kept her voice steady. "We won't give up without a fight," she said, her words cutting through the tension. The men looked at each other, their resolve wavering. "You're making a mistake," the scarred man growled, but he didn't make a move. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the standoff was over. The first shot rang out, followed by another, and then everything descended into chaos. The riders reacted too late, scrambling for cover, But Ethan and Roy were ready. Shots fired from all sides, the sound echoing in the cabin as the riders dropped one by one. The cold wind rushed through the broken door, but inside, the heat of battle was all-consuming. Emily stayed low, her arms wrapped around her daughter, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. The battle felt endless, but eventually, the last of the riders was down, their bodies sprawled in the snow outside the cabin. It was over. For now. As the last man fell, Ethan lowered his rifle, his face grim but resolute. Roy was standing beside him, his chest heaving, but his expression unreadable. Emily stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She glanced at David, who was staring at the men outside with wide, unblinking eyes. He said nothing, but she could see the weight of the situation settling on his small shoulders. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, but his gaze never left the door. "For now," he said, "but we need to keep moving." Emily nodded, though the words felt hollow in her chest. The fight was far from over, but for now, they had survived. And that, in this unforgiving world, was enough. The aftermath of the battle left a heavy silence in the cabin, the once persistent wind now sounding like a distant murmur against the walls. The storm had passed, but its memory still lingered, both in the cold air outside and in the minds of those who had survived. Emily stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on the bodies of the fallen riders scattered across the snow. It was over, at least for now. She could feel the weight of what had happened settling in her chest. They had fought hard, and they had won. But the cost of survival was a price she wasn't sure she was prepared to pay. Roy stood beside her, his eyes cold as he surveyed the scene. He didn't speak, but his expression said it all. The past had finally caught up with him, and he had no idea how much longer he could run from it. Ethan, ever the stoic figure, checked the perimeter of the cabin once more. His movements were methodical, his eyes sharp, but even he couldn't hide the weariness in his stance. He had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "It's done," he said, turning to Roy. "We need to move." Roy nodded, but didn't respond. Emily's heart clenched. She had known from the start that Roy wasn't the kind of man who could simply walk away from his past. And now, with Cutter's men gone, there was only one thing left for him to do. Face whatever had been chasing him for all these years. She couldn't understand it, couldn't even begin to fathom the weight of what Roy had been through, but she could see the toll it had taken on him. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly, stepping closer to him. Roy looked at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough. "But I can't stay here. I can't risk putting you all in danger again." Emily's heart twisted, but she knew he was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The people who had been after Roy weren't the kind to give up easily, and if they learned that the trail had gone cold in Pine Ridge, they would be back. She looked over at Ethan, who was now gathering their supplies. His eyes met hers, and she saw the same weariness reflected in his gaze. They had both known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. "We can't stay," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. "We'll leave at first light." Ethan nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It's the only choice." As the evening wore on, Emily sat by the fire, her daughter asleep in her arms. David was sitting beside her, his head resting on her shoulder, still too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation. But Emily could see the shadows of fear in his eyes, the way his small hands trembled every time there was a loud noise. It broke her heart to see him like this. He was just a boy, no older than when she had first left home, and yet he had already seen too much. Roy had insisted on leaving that night, but Emily had convinced him to stay until the morning. They couldn't leave in the dark, not with the snow still falling and the roads uncertain. So they had made camp in the cabin for one final night, though Emily knew it would be their last. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Emily gazed into the flames, lost in thought. She wondered what the future held, if they would find a place to settle down, a place where they could be safe. But deep down, she knew that safety was an illusion. The world was a dangerous place, and no matter how hard they tried to outrun their past, it would always find them. "What if they come after us again?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's heart broke at the fear in his eyes. She kissed his forehead softly, pulling him closer. "They won't," she said, her voice filled with as much certainty as she could muster. "We're going to be all right, I promise." She wasn't sure if she believed it herself, but she had to say it. For David's sake. For her own. The night was long, but eventually, sleep found them all. When morning came, it was with the same heavy silence that had followed them for days. They packed their things quickly, moving with practiced efficiency. The cabin had been their sanctuary, but it was no longer safe. It was time to leave. As they stepped outside, the world seemed quieter than usual, the sky a dull gray, heavy with the remnants of the storm. Emily glanced back at the cabin one last time, knowing that she wouldn't be returning. She had no idea where they would go next, but one thing was certain. They would face whatever came their way together. As the trio headed out into the wilderness, Emily felt a strange sense of determination settle in her chest. They would survive. They always had. And no matter what lay ahead, they would fight for each other. Together, they were strong. And as long as they had each other, that would be enough. The days that followed their departure from Pine Ridge were long and filled with uncertainty. As the trio made their way through the snow-covered landscape, they kept to the small trails, avoiding any larger paths that might give away their location. Emily's heart was heavy with the burden of the unknown, but she held tightly to the one thing that mattered, her family. She could hear the soft crunch of the snow beneath their boots as they traveled, the cold wind biting at their faces, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the constant feeling that danger was still lurking just beyond the horizon. David, despite the fear that lingered in his eyes, was adjusting. He had grown quieter in the past few days, perhaps realizing that their lives were never going to be the same again. His small hand clutched hers, and though his grip was tight, he said nothing. Emily often found herself looking over her shoulder, even when there was no sign of danger. Roy, too, was distant. He had always carried a heavy burden, but now it seemed as though the weight of it was finally breaking through. He would glance at her every now and then, his expression soft but unreadable, as if he was trying to find a way to explain the past he could never outrun. Ethan had fallen into a rhythm, his movements as calm and methodical as always. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always something useful, a warning about the terrain, a note about the direction they were heading. Despite the cold, he seemed to have an unshakable resolve, and in some strange way, his presence was comforting. But even Ethan, who had lived through much, seemed to feel the weight of their situation. They were heading into unfamiliar territory, and though they had no real destination in mind, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something they weren't prepared for. On the third day of their journey, they reached the edge of a dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before them like a wall, dark and foreboding. The path ahead seemed to disappear into the wilderness, and Emily hesitated. "Should we stop for the night?" she asked, her voice soft, though the decision weighed on her heavily. Ethan looked toward the forest, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's safer to keep moving," he said. "We don't know what's in there." Emily didn't argue. The forest may have seemed like a safe refuge from the open plains, but she knew they couldn't afford to take any chances. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. They continued on, pushing deeper into the woods. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the snow, and the trees blocked much of the wind, making the air seem still and suffocating. Every so often, Emily would glance back, half expecting to see the riders from the other day reappearing, their shadows stretching long behind them. But each time, there was nothing. No one followed. They came to a small clearing as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the snow. Emily could feel the exhaustion setting in, her body aching from the days of travel, but there was no time to rest. They needed to find shelter, something to keep them hidden until they could figure out their next move. Ethan motioned toward a small cave in the side of the mountain, barely visible through the thick trees. "We'll stay there for the night," he said. "It'll keep us hidden." Emily nodded, grateful for the suggestion, and they made their way toward the cave. The entrance was small, barely big enough for them to crouch through, but once inside, it was dry and warm enough to offer some comfort. Roy went to the back of the cave, his expression tense, while Ethan gathered firewood. Emily set down her pack, her muscles sore from the journey, and took a moment to breathe. The cave was small, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold wilderness outside. As the fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their faces, Emily looked at the two men, Roy and Ethan. They were both silent, lost in their own thoughts. The air between them felt thick, the unspoken tension palpable. She couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the past caught up with them again. Roy, still standing near the back of the cave, turned to her, his eyes softer than they had been in days. "You don't have to keep running," he said quietly. Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" she asked. Roy took a deep breath, his hand running through his unkempt hair. "I've been running for too long," he said, his voice filled with something Emily couldn't quite identify. "I don't know if I can keep doing it. But you don't have to stay on the run forever. There's a chance for you to have a life, a real one. You don't have to keep hiding." His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Emily's heart twisted. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the choices he had made. And in that moment, she realized that Roy wasn't just running from the people after him. He was running from himself. "You don't have to keep running either," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her own journey. "We're all just trying to survive. And as long as we're together, we'll find a way." Roy didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the ground, lost in thought. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe it's time to stop running." Emily didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since they had set out from Pine Ridge, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. They had made it this far. They had fought for their survival. And maybe, just maybe, they could find something more than just survival. Maybe, in this wild, unforgiving world, they could still find a place to call home. The morning after their long night in the cave came quietly. The world outside was still blanketed in snow, the air thick and biting, but the forest had an eerie calm. Inside the small cave, the fire had burned low, leaving only the faint glow of embers. Emily stood at the entrance, watching the landscape stretch out before her, the trees heavy with snow, the world still and quiet. It was a moment of peace, but even that felt fleeting. Ethan was already up, moving silently as he packed their things. Roy sat near the fire, his back against the rock wall, staring into the flames. David was still asleep, curled up in the small blanket Emily had made for him, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically. Despite the exhaustion from the journey, Emily couldn't help but notice the change in Roy. The weight of his past seemed to be lifting, at least for a moment. But Emily knew better than to believe that everything would be all right. Not yet. The road ahead was still uncertain. The riders that had followed them were gone, but the danger was never truly gone. She knew that it would always find them, no matter where they went. They couldn't outrun it forever. Emily turned back into the cave, moving to where David slept. She ran her fingers through his hair, smoothing it back gently, watching him for a moment before she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "It's going to be all right," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. Roy had been quiet since the night before, his words still lingering in the air. He hadn't talked about his past in detail, but there was something in his eyes that told her more than he was willing to say. "You don't have to keep running," she had told him the night before, and in that moment, she had meant it. But she didn't know how to help him stop. She didn't know how to fix what had been broken for so long. But she knew one thing. They had to keep moving, together. The world was too dangerous, too unpredictable. They had to keep fighting for each other. As the morning wore on, they packed up and prepared to leave the cave. Emily took one last look at the small space that had offered them shelter, her thoughts heavy with the knowledge that their time here was over. They needed to get out of the open, to find a safer place to rest. They couldn't stay in the wilderness for too long. The tracks of the riders from the day before were already beginning to fade in the snow, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere. They made their way through the woods, moving as quietly as they could. The snow was deep, and the cold bit into their skin, but they kept going, driven by the need to survive. They didn't speak much, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Emily kept her eyes forward, scanning the trees, her senses heightened. She was always aware of what was around her, the distant creak of the trees, the flutter of wings above. The world had a way of shifting, changing in an instant, and Emily knew that the moment she let her guard down was the moment everything would fall apart. Hours passed before they came to a small, secluded valley, the trees thick and dense, blocking the view of anything beyond. It felt like the right place to rest. Ethan moved ahead, checking the area carefully before he gave a signal for them to follow. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, his voice as steady as ever. Emily nodded, relieved to finally stop. She watched as Ethan set up a small perimeter, his movements swift and practiced. Roy moved to the back of the camp, his face still unreadable, while David sat down on a log, his small hands pulling at the snow, making shapes in the cold earth. Emily's heart ached for him. He was just a child, and yet he had seen so much. She longed for a time when they could rest without fear, when his world wouldn't be filled with the kind of danger that seemed to follow them everywhere. As the fire crackled and the warmth from it spread through the camp, Emily found herself lost in thought, staring into the flames. She thought about what Roy had said, how maybe it was time to stop running. Was it possible? Could they find a place where they could truly be safe? Or was it just a dream, a fleeting hope that would shatter once again? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. They couldn't keep moving forever. They needed a place to rest, to rebuild. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was just as uncertain. But they had each other. And maybe that was enough. Roy joined her by the fire, sitting across from her, his face a little less tense than it had been the day before. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't keep running. But I don't know how to stop." Emily met his eyes, seeing the truth of his words. He had been running for so long that he didn't know how to live without looking over his shoulder. She didn't have the answers, but she understood. "We don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "We can find a way together." Roy didn't answer right away, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the tiredness of a man who had fought for too long. Either way, Emily could see that he was willing to try. As the fire burned low and the night fell around them, the sounds of the forest seemed to quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to rest. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, they had each other. The morning light filtered through the trees, soft and golden, the kind of sunlight that felt almost like a promise. The chill of the night had begun to recede, and the snow, though still thick on the ground, seemed to glisten with a quiet beauty. Emily stood at the edge of the camp, her gaze lost in the horizon. Her heart, though still burdened with the weight of their past struggles, felt a small stir of hope. It had been a long, hard journey, but they had made it this far. And in this moment, despite the fear that still lingered, she allowed herself to believe that there was a chance for something more, something better, for them all. Behind her, she could hear the soft murmurs of the camp coming to life. Roy had already begun checking the perimeter, moving with quiet efficiency. He was a man who had been running for so long that it was almost as if he didn't know how to stop. But Emily had seen the change in him. He had begun to let down his guard, just a little, as if the weight of the past was finally beginning to ease. Ethan, as always, was the first to be up and ready. He had spent the morning sharpening his knife, preparing for the next part of their journey. His quiet strength was a constant reassurance to Emily, though she could see the toll it had taken on him. He had carried the burden of their survival, and while his resolve remained, she knew that even he had limits. She turned toward the campfire, where David was still asleep, his small body curled up in the blankets. He had been so brave through everything, his young face often shadowed with worry, but never once did he complain. Emily's heart swelled with love for him. She had promised to protect him, and she would do whatever it took to keep that promise. The night had been calm, but there was always the sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of their camp. Roy had been right when he said they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Every day was a gamble, every moment a risk. But for now, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. As the camp settled into its morning routine, Emily joined Ethan by the fire, her breath coming out in a puff of cold air. "We need to keep moving," he said without looking at her, his tone as steady as ever. Emily nodded, knowing the unspoken truth in his words. The world wasn't kind to those who stayed still. They had to keep moving, keep running, because if they stopped, if they let their guard down, the danger would find them again. She had accepted that a long time ago. "Do you think we'll ever find a place to settle?" she asked, her voice soft but heavy with the weight of the question. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said simply. "But we'll keep looking. We'll keep fighting." Emily turned away, looking at Roy, who had just finished gathering firewood. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roy paused, his back to her. He didn't turn around, but she could see the slight tension in his shoulders. "I'm done running," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I don't know what that means yet, but I'm done." Emily felt a flicker of relief, though she didn't know what to make of his words. Roy had been a man haunted by his past, a man who had known only survival. But now, it seemed, he was ready to let go, ready to face whatever future lay ahead. "We'll face it together," she said softly, more to herself than to him. And Roy, without turning around, nodded. As they packed up and prepared to leave the camp, Emily felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. They had come so far, but there was still a long road ahead. The uncertainty loomed large, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had her family with her, and that was all she needed. The forest, though still wild and untamed, no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a place where they could begin again. The journey would be hard, she knew that, but they were survivors. They had fought through the worst of it, and they would keep fighting. They would find their place, a place where they could finally rest, where they could build something new. As the morning sun rose higher, the group moved out of the clearing, the sound of their footsteps muffled in the snow. Emily walked beside Roy, her hand in his, and David just ahead of them, his small figure darting through the trees with an energy that made Emily smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope. They had made it this far. They had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a place to call home. They would face whatever came next, together, and whatever the future held, they would face it as a family. For now, that was enough. Immerse yourself in the captivating world of Western stories, where survival, family, and rugged landscapes intertwine. Follow the journey of Emily and her family as they fight for survival in a dangerous and unforgiving world. After facing countless challenges, they find themselves on the run, constantly moving, always on edge. Their journey is filled with intense moments, from encounters with ruthless outlaws to quiet moments of introspection as they try to rebuild their lives. These Western stories explore the strength of the human spirit, the power of family bonds, and the relentless pursuit of safety in a world filled with danger. As they fight to survive, Emily, Roy, and Ethan must come to terms with their pasts and decide what they want for their future. Will they find peace, or will the shadow of danger always follow them? These gripping Western stories will keep you on the edge of your seat as you witness the emotional struggle and physical hardships that these characters must endure. Each twist and turn in the narrative offers a deeper understanding of what it means to fight for a future, a family, and a place to call home. Follow along as the characters move from one challenge to the next, searching for hope in the midst of chaos. These Western stories remind us that even in the harshest of environments, the desire for a better life can fuel survival and resilience. Their journey isn't just about running from danger, but also about finding a way to stop running and stand firm. As they come to realize, sometimes the only way to truly survive is by sticking together and fighting for a new beginning. For those who love compelling tales set in the Wild West, these stories offer a rich blend of adventure, heart, and the untold struggles that define the human experience in the harshest conditions. Let these Western stories take you on an unforgettable ride through a world that tests the limits of endurance, hope, and what it means to truly live.